Even someone with the most prestigious title in combat sports might make decisions they'll regret. In some cases, no matter how ideal a career they have for themselves, there will always be that one thing they wish they hadn't done. In this video, we're going to list down some of the biggest regrets UFC fighters have had in their career, so stay tuned to find out. Starting off with number 7, Alexander Gustafsson, not waiting for title shot. Many felt that a rematch between Alexander Gustafsson and Jon Jones was justified after their initial 5-round bout. The Swede reportedly presented Jones with the toughest challenge of his brief but illustrious career. A lot of us were afraid that nobody else could pull off the feat. The champion finally had a worthy opponent, and we begged for a rematch. But Jones had no interest in it happening. If Gustafsson wanted to challenge the young champion for his title, he would have to fight at least once more. After 5 months, 2 rounds, and 1 victory, Gustafsson was ready to rematch the king. In a cruel twist of fate, the Mauler would not survive long enough to confront Jones. But once Jones was injured and had to pull out of his replacement match against Daniel Cormier, Gustafsson was once again in a position to request his promised title chance. Instead of waiting for his chance at UFC Gold, the UFC suggested he take another fight. Choosing to fight Anthony "Rumble" Johnson in front of the crowd was probably the smart move, but he should have waited. After years of waiting, we finally got our desired rematch between him and Jon Jones for the light heavyweight title, but by then, Gustafsson was past his prime and lost convincingly to the one and only Jon Bones Jones. Up at number 6, Ronda Rousey, saying she wouldn't fight Cyborg at 145. Like Peyton Manning has Tom Brady, the Argentinian forward Lionel Messi has Cristiano Ronaldo, and Novak Djokovic has Rafael Nadal, Cyborg Santos was the ultimate competitor to Ronda. At least, in some cases, she was. Rousey was already one of the most dominant female champions in the history of mixed martial arts, and she had almost walked through every woman who had stood in her way at the time. Considering her grappling prowess, Olympic silver medalist Sarah McMahon was expected to give Rousey a run for her money. The UFC could put anyone in front of Rousey, and everybody would receive enormous publicity, but none of them would be Cyborg. They might have been if Rousey had been willing to compete above and beyond the bantamweight class, but she declined the opportunity. In other words, she just wouldn't fight at 145. The world will never forgive the sport for failing to put Cyborg and Rousey in a cage together during their respective and thankfully overlapping primes. But much like the Manny Pacquiao vs. Floyd Mayweather battle that boxing fans were long demanding for. Granted, that fight also took way longer than it should have, but we're not complaining. Moving on to number 5, Jon Jones not fighting Chael Sonnen at UFC 151. Okay, so if we're talking about regrets, then his positive cocaine test right before his huge UFC 182 fight with Daniel Cormier is one example. And then you might also want to bring up the fight and death threats that became legendary just before the main event. Oh, and how can we forget the 2012 vehicle crash caused by a drunk driver? Seems like these regrets might even keep the athlete up at night. Yes, he has a lot to regret during the span of his life. Despite Jones's many missteps, it may be his refusal to fight Chael Sonnen on 8 days' notice at UFC 151 that will haunt him the most. In an interview, UFC boss Dana White said that a fighter like Jon Jones, who's supposed to be the best pound-for-pound fighter in the world, has to step up every time. He then said that he doesn't think this decision will help with Jones's popularity, considering most people dislike him already. Needless to say, the UFC boss was very disappointed by his decision. Although tensions have escalated since then, Jones is aware of how rapidly the UFC may turn on him and how easily the organization can bury him under the mountain of propaganda it can spread through the press. He was no longer the strongest guy alive and instead picked his battles already. Unfortunately, the fight world is not a place for picky people. Coming up at number 4, Anderson Silva coming back. Even while it wasn't ideal, given what we know now, most of us would still accept that resolution. The champion had been knocked out once, and then his leg was snapped in 2 separate fights. Anderson Silva, who was about to turn 39, had only to recover from his injury, and then he could stroll off into the sunset. But Silva, like the vast majority of guys who have ever competed in MMA, would exit the cage on his own terms. He wouldn't retire from MMA until he was confident that both of his legs could carry him through at least one more fight inside the octagon, the place that delivered him unimaginable fame and money when he made his professional debut nearly 15 years ago. Of course, we UFC required it in many aspects as well. For his fans' sake, it was vital that the Spider should regain at least some of his former reputation. We couldn't let the sight of him screaming in anguish on a stretcher be the last image of the unbeatable fighter he once was. On the other hand, we were completely incorrect. He had no right to make a return. He should have kept away from the sport and allowed us to continue to believe that no athlete is vulnerable to the temptation of performance-enhancing drugs. Perhaps this was the only occasion Silva cheated using steroids, but the reality remains, there's no way to prove it. At number 3, Jacare Souza, not waiting for the middleweight title fight. At his peak, the Brazilian middleweight was among the best ever. But honestly speaking, despite his many victories, Jacare has never been given a shot at the UFC championship. Maybe if the grappler had been more patient, he might have won the UFC gold? The answer is yes, as stated by the man himself. According to a recent interview, Jacare considers his April 2017 decision to fight Robert Whittaker instead of waiting for a crack at then UFC middleweight champion Michael Bisping as his worst mistake during his time in the UFC. In the UFC, Jacare was 7-1 at the time, with his lone defeat coming at the hands of Yoel Romero. Although Jacare's status as the top candidate was never officially acknowledged, the results of the interview suggest that he may have been the frontrunner before the Count opted to wait for a fight with Georges St-Pierre at the end of 2017. Because of this, Souza decided to fight Whittaker before the winner was announced, and he ended up losing via knockout. 3 months later, Whittaker would challenge Romero for the interim UFC middleweight title and win by unanimous decision. If Jacare had waited a bit longer, he might have been rematched with Romero for an interim title, even if he never received his shot against Bisping. As a result, he now considers this choice to be his biggest professional MMA regret. Moving on to number 2, Anthony Pettis, not holding on for the lightweight title. When Anthony Pettis memorably submitted Benson Henderson to win the UFC lightweight title in 2013, many wondered if he could have done this sooner. This would have been the case if a few key events had been handled differently. In 2010, Pettis was undeniably the most popular fighter in mixed martial arts. At the end of that year, he used his signature Showtime kick to knock out Henderson and win the WEC lightweight championship. In addition, Pettis was promised a unification bout with the UFC lightweight champion after it was confirmed that the WEC roster would be joining the larger organization. But that all changed with 2011's inaugural UFC event. The lightweight title fight between Frankie Edgar and Gray Maynard at UFC 125 ended in a draw. Pettis found himself in a difficult position because it was obvious that a rematch would be necessary. Showtime probably could have waited for the winner of the rematch to keep the concept of a unification bout alive, given his unprecedented level of popularity. But he was so sure of his abilities that he accepted to fight up-and-comer Clay Guida, and he ended up on the losing end of a decision. So while Showtime did eventually get his opportunity and win the UFC lightweight title, he had to earn it the hard way by prevailing in 3 additional challenging fights. It's safe to assume he now wishes he had waited just a little bit longer. Finally, at number 1, Tony Ferguson, not waiting on the title fight with Khabib. After several postponements, the long-awaited battle for the lightweight title between Khabib Nurmagomedov and Tony Ferguson would finally take place at UFC 249 in April of 2020. But to everyone's surprise, yet again, it didn't. No one could have foreseen that the conflict would end in disaster once again, with neither participant at fault. Instead, the COVID-19 epidemic hit. UFC 249 was postponed indefinitely, and it appeared that Khabib wasn't allowed to travel in order to defend his title. 1 month later, in May, the event was rescheduled, but with Khabib's travel problems still unresolved, the interim lightweight title fight between Ferguson and Justin Gaethje was booked. It's possible that Ferguson could have refused to fight without Khabib being present. After all, El Cucuy had won his previous 12 bouts, and the Eagle vs. El Cucuy was a match that everyone wanted to watch. But he instead agreed to fight Gaethje and was stopped in the 5th round by a technical knockout. Ferguson's loss eliminated him from championship contention instantly. To make matters worse, the UFC's ability to host events on Abu Dhabi's Fight Island meant that Khabib returned far sooner than anyone had anticipated. 5 months after Ferguson's crushing setback, in October at UFC 254, he faced and defeated Gaethje, Considering the proximity of the deadline and the fact that Khabib vs. Ferguson was one of the most anticipated matches in UFC history, it's safe to assume that the promotion would have caved if El Cucuy had just stood his ground. That's a wrap for this video. Who do you think made the worst decision for their career in this list? Let us know in the comments below. If you liked the video, hit like, share, and subscribe to our channel. See you in the next one.